Many of us will remember the great French philosopher Descartes, who is known for his adage, "I think, therefore I am." Well, they tell a cute little story about how one day the French philosopher Descartes went into a French tavern, and the barkeep said, "Monsieur, would you like a cognac?" And he said, "I think not." And poof, he was gone. According to his own philosophy, if he wasn't thinking, he no longer existed. Sometimes we see people go through their lives without really thinking about what the meaning of life is, whether there's purpose, value, a higher purpose to our existence here on earth. Many people just plod on through, not even thinking about whether we have meaning to live a life that's filled with happiness and excitement, especially as Jews who are loyal to the Torah and its mitzvahs. And as our sages teach us, the true way to authentic happiness is only through Torah and mitzvahs, as we will soon see. You know, a lot of us just get into a kind of rut where we start thinking, I've done it this way all my life. I don't want to change, I can't change, and I don't need to change. I'm happy the way I am. And nobody wants to step outside the realm of where they immediately are. But if a person will start thinking outside the box, outside the limitations of where they are, where they've been, they might go to a much higher plateau in terms of their own fulfillment, their happiness, and a sense of real meaning, value, and purpose in life. Now, from a Jewish point of view, I call that thinking outside the locks. You know, the things which confine us to the way we've thought about all things Jewish in the past, and why we resign ourselves to just staying where we are. I'm happy where I am. I call it the apple pie and coffee syndrome. This story goes where there's a fellow from Europe, came over here and was very self-conscious about the way he spoke. And he didn't want anybody to know that he didn't speak English as a native. So he asked a friend of his, "Tell me how to say something that I can eat." He says, "Okay, apple pie and coffee." So he says, "Apple pie and coffee," and repeats the phrase numerous times. He goes into the cafeteria and sits down, and with a smile, confidently he says, "Apple pie and coffee." Well, the waiter brings out the apple pie and coffee, and it was delicious, of course. Apple pie and coffee for breakfast, for lunch, and for supper. Now, as you all know, as much as one might enjoy any food, it can get a little tiresome after multiple times, especially every day, every week, and for a month, apple pie and coffee. So finally he says to his friend, "Tell me how to say something else." So he says, "Cheese sandwich," and he practices in front of the mirror, "cheese sandwich." Now he goes back into the cafeteria, sits down proudly and confidently, and the waiter comes over expecting him to order the usual, when he smiles and says, "Cheese sandwich." And the waiter says, "White bread or white bread?" And immediately he goes back to apple pie and coffee. You know, reverting to the most comfortable position that we have isn't really going to get us very far in life. It'll just be the same old apple pie and coffee syndrome. So we need to think about who we are, what our goals are in life, and how from a Jewish perspective we can achieve those goals vis-a-vis learning and studying, delving into the depths and the beauty and the bounty of Torah. The Gemara, the Talmud, relates an incident which is also supported by a midrash that brings the story of Alexander the Great. Now, we all remember Alexander the Great, Alexander the Macedon, conqueror of the civilized world at that time. Well, the Gemara substantiates a lot of those stories that particularly applied to his relationship to the Jewish people. And there is an incident which is recorded in the Talmud, in Kedushin. That's an amazing insight into how a person was willing to go outside their own boundaries, outside the box, or as we would say, outside the locks. Alexander the Great was once about to invade a city called Cartagena. Now, the amazing thing about this city, Cartagena, was that it was inhabited only by women. So he decided, this is a city that has to be conquered. It's in my way. It's part of the civilized world. I want it. I'm taking it. Well, the women of the city of Cartagena sent out a representative, and they posed the following statement to him. "You are Alexander the Great, great conqueror, leader of the Western civilized world, conquering countries, civilizations. And now you're about to invade a city that is inhabited merely by defenseless women. How is that going to be a feather in your helmet, as it were? If you win, what will you tell the world? That you defeated a group of unarmed women? And if you lose, well, then you'll lose big time, because then what will you say? Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the world, lost to a group of unarmed women. So Alexander the Great, when he did something which was rather unprecedented for a person of his stature, he went back and he thought about what the situation was. Remember our friend Descartes, I think, therefore I am? Well, Alexander the Great took very seriously this idea of thinking about doing something that might have grave consequences to it. What was the risk? What was the gain? Anybody in business would tell you that you never take a risk unless it's worth the gain. You have to measure the risk against the gain, and that's what he did. So what would he accomplish? Would it in fact be a victory for him, or would it be a loss? So he in effect made a decision that he was going to change his whole raison d'etre. He's going to change his whole life view, his whole military strategy right at that point. And what did he do? He decided he was not going to invade the city. But it didn't stop there. No. What he did was to literally etch in stone on the gate of the city that he, Alexander the Great, was a fool until he came to the city of Carthagena and learned wisdom from women. Now, that may not seem like a very great thing to you, but imagine somebody were to come to your city where you live, and let's say that person just happened to be the President of the United States, whoever that might be at any given time. And the President says, I'd like to seek your advice and those in your community, right here in this Jewish center right over here. I'd like to ask you, what do you think my policy should be about the Middle East? And you tell them, well, we believe that the Jewish people have a right to their own land, and that the Jewish people have existed, and therefore you should go easier with them. Do everything that you can to make sure that the Jewish people not only survive but thrive, and that the institutions of learning, that yeshivot, and that people that are active in doing acts of kindness, that they're supported and backed by the United States, by everybody across both sides of the aisle. The President says, you know, I think I'm going to be much more active in my position to help the people of Israel, and I'm going to be really, really strong about it in a way that I never was before. And then the next day, all the major media, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the major news stations, broadcast media, they announced that the President of the United States has modified his policy toward Israel based on what a group of men and women in a particular Jewish community advised him to do. Now, that would be very unlikely. A, that he would change his policy, and B, that he would take your simple, humble, but very wise advice. If he made that decision, he'd make sure that he took the total credit for it. Well, that is exactly what Alexander the Great did. He went and he put his name on a sign to let the world know that he, Alexander the Great, had changed his whole worldview and was willing to go and change it because he learned a nugget of wisdom, gained a scintilla of knowledge that was going to change his military strategy and his whole life philosophy. Now that's a remarkable thing, that a person is willing to change after their whole life. They said, I've always done it this way. I've never changed my philosophy just because I learned something new. Now, if that's what Alexander the Great was willing to do, and that story is recorded so that you and I are talking about it today, many, many, many hundreds, thousands of years later, could it be that there's some truth to that? Wouldn't it mean that you and I, if we're willing to take that step outside the box or outside the lox and bagels philosophy, the apple pie and coffee syndrome, and think a little bit about who we are and realize that the Torah is the highest form of wisdom, and if we'll only invest in ourselves a little bit to take that step, to venture outside of what we thought, our preconceived notions, our thinking outside the locks, as it were, then maybe we can grow. And in fact, there's no maybe about it. We will grow. But we've got to be a little bit brave and a little bit bold. And sometimes we have to recognize that perhaps we don't want to admit what the truth is. But if you look for it, as Shlomo Amelech, King Solomon said, if you look for it like silver and gold, like something precious, you'll find it. But of course, one has to be convinced that if something is the truth, that A, it is the truth, and that B, that will act on it. Now, what is the truth exactly? So while we're on the subject of Greeks, there was another Greek whose name was Diogenes. And there's a kind of Greek mythical story around Diogenes that said that he would hold up a lamp and go around the city of Athens looking for the truth. I'm looking for the truth, holding up this lamp, or looking for an honest man, as another version goes. So there's a story, another cute story, that relates that this Diogenes was once in London. And there he was in his toga, holding up the lamp, and he's walking around by Buckingham Palace, and a couple of the palace guards come up to him and say, "My Sailpin, what are you doing there with that lamp in the middle of the night?" He says, "Oh, I'm looking for the truth." They say, "Oh, the truth, are you? Well, jolly good. That's quite a noble aspiration. Carry on." And next he was seen in France, in the Champs-Élysées, and he's walking around late at night, and two gendarmes come and say, "Monsieur, what are you doing here walking around at night holding up a lamp?" And he says to them, "I'm looking for the truth." "Ah, la vérité," they say. Looking for the truth. Mais oui, carry on. And so he did. And then one day, Diogenes was reportedly in New York City, and he was found mugged on the pavement in Central Park by a couple of New York City's finest. And they looked at him and said, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing down there? What are you doing on the ground?" He says, "I'm looking for my lamp." Looking for his lamp, not merely the truth. The vessel with which he could see the truth was the lamp. Sometimes we have to ask ourselves, are we looking for the truth with the right lamp? Or are we like the fellow that was looking for his wallet by a streetlight, and a fellow comes over and says, "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for my wallet." He says, "You know where he lost it?" "Yeah, I think I've lost it about 10 blocks from here." He says, "Well, why don't you look over there?" He says, "Well, the light's better over here." The light may be better, but it's not going to get you where you need to go if it's not a light where you have to be. If you haven't lit up your mind by thinking outside the box or thinking outside the locks, by looking for the truth in the right places and then doing something with it, then you really haven't done yourself justice. There's a story that's reported took place in the 18th century, mid-1700s, took place in Europe, at the time of the great Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Elio of Vilna, whose books today on geometry are found in libraries like the Yale Library, on mathematics. And that was just a derivative of his Torah knowledge. He was known to be one of the greatest thinking geniuses, one of the greatest minds that the Jewish people have ever known. In his century, he was a light until not only the Jewish people, but there were many non-Jews who sought his erudition and knowledge. One day, two scientists from Russia approached a man by the name of Mendelssohn, who himself at one time was an authentic believer in Judaism, but had gone off the track and tried to take other people with him, trying to bend the laws of Judaism to the way he wanted to see it. Well, these two fellows asked him if in fact they could identify a particular stone that he had, and that they had. And they took the stone and they brought it to him, and he said, "No, I can't identify it, but there is somebody. There is somebody by the name of Elio of Vilna, whose knowledge and vast wisdom will apply to sciences like this. Take it to him." So they got an audience with him. He looked at it. It was in its raw state, where he took the stone, in its unrefined state, and he asked his assistant to take a glass of water and put the stone in it. As he did, the stone began to evaporate. It dissipated, and all the water evaporated in a puff of vapor. He said, "The stone is a sapphire in its raw form. This is what it will do to the water." And because it dissipated the water, the H2O, that stone, as we know, is a sapphire. They were amazed by that. So they went back to this fellow Mendelssohn, and when he heard it, he was amazed. He said, "I knew he would be the one to understand it. I knew he would be the one to be able to divulge its identity. And now I understand," he said, "how Moshe Rabbeinu was able to split the Red Sea, the Yam Suf, by taking his staff, which was made out of sapphire, and putting it into the sea, and then the entire sea split. Now I understand it." When the Vilna Gaon heard this, he says, that is what apostasy is. Somebody who will deny the very truth of what the Torah is to fit their own rationale. In fact, indeed, while the staff was made out of sapphire, first of all, The Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu never put it into the ocean, never put it into the sea. He merely raised it above it, specifically so nobody would think that it was doing it per se. In addition to that, the Yam Suf didn't split merely because of the properties of this stone. It split because HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded it to. The properties of the stone were merely secondary. The Vilna Gaon knew what the truth was. Unfortunately, other people were not willing to admit it. It's kind of like two men that were going down the road, and one of them says, hey, look at that cat on top of the roof. And the other says, hey, that's not a cat, that's a bird. And they're arguing back and forth, and they say, look, let's make a bet. I'm sure that that is a cat. And the other fellow says, I'm sure it's a bird, so let's take a rock and throw it. And if the thing takes off, we'll obviously know what it is. So that's what they did, approach the roof, they take a rock, throw it, and the thing takes off like a shot, flapping its wings, westward bound in the sky. And one friend looks at the other and says, well, that's the first time I ever saw a cat fly. Cats do not fly. Unless a person is so convinced that their own agenda is real, even when they see the truth in front of them, they'll deny it. So you and I have to understand that we've got to think outside the box, look for the truth where it can be found, and when we do find it, recognize that we have to take a step outside the apple pie and coffee syndrome if we want to grow and be better. And the only way to do that is to begin the learning process, finding out what's in the Torah from authentic sources, and realize that the truth is the truth, because cats don't fly. And as we learn from our friend Descartes, we have to think about who we are, what we are as a Jewish people, where we come from, who we can be, and the greatness that's ours, if we'll only just start thinking outside the locks.